In the year 552 AD, two men in the coarse robes of Christian monks walk through the gates of Constantinople, carrying hollow bamboo walking staves, the kind of humble traveling implement that no customs official at any border crossing along the entire length of the Silk Road would think to examine with particular care. Inside those staves, packed carefully to survive a journey of thousands of miles across some of the most heavily guarded frontiers in the ancient world, are silkworm eggs, smuggled out of China in defiance of an imperial export prohibition that has protected the most lucrative manufacturing monopoly in the ancient economy for centuries. What these two men are carrying, whether they fully grasp its significance or not, will within a generation break a monopoly that had generated wealth for Chinese emperors since before the reign of Julius Caesar, and will transform the Byzantine Empire from the largest single customer of the world's most valuable manufactured good into a producer capable of manufacturing that good entirely within its own borders. To understand what these two monks accomplish, it is necessary first to understand the scale and the mechanics of the monopoly they are breaking, because the Chinese silk monopoly that has existed for the better part of a millennium before 552 AD is not merely a matter of geographic advantage or accumulated craft expertise, the way that many pre-modern manufacturing advantages function. It is a monopoly maintained through the most direct and deliberate means available to an ancient state: capital punishment for anyone caught attempting to export silkworm eggs, silkworm larvae, or mulberry seeds, the plant whose leaves are the exclusive food source on which silk production depends, beyond the borders of Chinese-controlled territory. The technology of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms and the processing of their cocoons into raw silk thread has been refined within China across roughly 4,000 years of continuous development by the middle of the 6th century AD, producing a manufacturing process of such sophistication and such carefully guarded secrecy that no civilization outside China has managed to replicate it, despite centuries of contact, trade, and, undoubtedly, considerable effort at industrial espionage. The value that this manufacturing monopoly generates for China across the centuries preceding 552 AD is difficult to overstate in terms of its significance to the broader structure of ancient Eurasian trade. Silk functions, throughout the classical and late antique periods, not merely as a luxury textile, but as something closer to a global reserve currency. A good so universally desired, so difficult to produce outside its single point of origin, and so portable relative to its value that it becomes one of the primary instruments through which long-distance trade across the entire Eurasian landmass is conducted. Roman writers of the early imperial period complain bitterly about the drain of gold and silver flowing eastward to pay for Chinese silk, with Pliny the Elder estimating in the 1st century AD that Rome's silk purchases alone cost the empire tens of millions of sesterces annually, a sum significant enough that the Roman Senate periodically debates, without ever successfully implementing, sumptuary legislation intended to restrict silk consumption specifically to reduce this outward flow of precious metal. The Byzantine Empire, as the direct institutional and territorial continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire following the collapse of Roman authority in the West during the 5th century, inherits both the Roman fascination with silk as the preeminent marker of imperial and aristocratic status, and the Roman position as a purchaser of Chinese silk rather than a producer of it. By the 6th century, under the reign of the Emperor Justinian I, silk has become deeply woven into the fabric of Byzantine imperial ideology and court ceremony in ways that extend well beyond simple luxury consumption. Imperial robes, the vestments of the highest church officials, the ceremonial hangings of the imperial palace, and the diplomatic gifts through which Byzantine emperors cultivate relationships with foreign rulers all depend on a continuous and reliable supply of silk, most of which arrives in Constantinople, not through direct trade with China itself. A connection made extraordinarily difficult by the vast distances and the numerous intermediary powers separating the two empires, but through a chain of intermediary traders and, critically, through the territory of the Sassanid Persian Empire, which occupies the geographic position astride the overland Silk Road routes connecting China to the Mediterranean world. This Persian intermediary position creates a structural vulnerability in Byzantine access to silk that becomes acutely apparent during the periodic wars between the Byzantine and Sassanid empires that punctuate the 6th century with grinding regularity. Persia does not merely transport silk through its territory as a neutral commercial intermediary, it actively controls, taxes, and at various points restricts the flow of silk into Byzantine markets as an instrument of economic and political leverage, extracting substantial customs revenue from every bolt of silk that passes through Persian-controlled trade routes on its way to Byzantine markets, and periodically closing or restricting this trade entirely during episodes of open warfare between the two empires. Justinian's government, acutely aware of this vulnerability, makes several documented attempts in the years preceding 552 to circumvent Persian control of the silk trade by cultivating alternative supply routes, most notably through diplomatic overtures to the Christian kingdom of Aksum in what is now Ethiopia, hoping that Aksumite merchants might be induced to purchase silk directly from Indian or Sri Lankan intermediary markets and ship it to Byzantine territory via the Red Sea, bypassing Persian territory entirely. These efforts achieve only limited and unreliable success, since the underlying problem, that Byzantium possesses no domestic silk production capacity whatsoever and remains entirely dependent on some external supply chain, whichever route that supply chain happens to follow, is not actually solved by rerouting the trade around Persian territory, rather than eliminating Byzantine dependence on foreign silk production altogether. It is against this backdrop of chronic strategic vulnerability that the account preserved by the Byzantine historian Procopius, our primary contemporary source for the silkworm smuggling episode, describes the arrival of two monks at Justinian's court sometime in the early 550s, presenting the emperor with an extraordinary proposition. According to Procopius, these monks had spent considerable time in a region he identifies as the country of the Seres, a term Byzantine geographical writing generally applies to China or Central Asian territories in close contact with Chinese silk production, and had observed firsthand the process by which silkworms are cultivated and their cocoons processed into raw silk thread. The monks proposed to Justinian that if the emperor provides adequate incentive, they will return to this territory and attempt to bring back silkworm eggs capable of establishing an independent silk production capacity within Byzantine territory itself, eliminating the empire's dependence on external supply chains entirely. The identity of these monks and the precise circumstances under which they had gained access to knowledge of sericulture, normally restricted with the same severity as any other closely guarded Chinese state secret, remains a subject of some scholarly uncertainty, complicated by the fact that a slightly different and possibly conflating account, preserved by the later Byzantine chronicler Theophanes of Byzantium, describes the smuggling episode as having been carried out by a single individual identified as a Persian rather than explicitly Byzantine or generically Christian monk, raising the possibility that Procopius's account and Theophanes' account may represent either two related but distinct historical episodes, or two somewhat differing versions of the same underlying event, transmitted through different channels and with details that shifted in the retelling across the intervening decades before either historian committed the story to written form. What both versions agree on, regardless of these discrepancies in the precise identity of the smugglers, is the core mechanism of the smuggling operation itself. Silkworm eggs, whether transported by Christian monks with prior missionary experience in Central Asia or by a Persian agent operating with more directly commercial motivations, are concealed within hollow bamboo canes or walking staves, an ingenious solution to the fundamental logistical problem that silkworm eggs, unlike raw silk thread itself or finished silk textiles, require protection from crushing, from extreme temperature fluctuation, and from the kind of casual inspection that any conspicuous smuggling container would inevitably invite at the numerous customs checkpoints, caravan inspection stations, and border crossings that any overland route between Chinese silk-producing regions and Constantinople would necessarily require crossing. Whether the operation is understood as a single continuous journey, or, as some modern historians studying the episode have suggested based on the practical difficulties involved, a longer process potentially requiring an initial reconnaissance mission, followed by a second dedicated smuggling expedition. The eggs that ultimately arrive in Constantinople survive the journey in sufficient quantity and sufficient viability to allow Byzantine authorities to establish the beginnings of a domestic sericulture industry, hatching successfully and producing larvae capable of feeding, spinning cocoons, and ultimately generating a new generation of eggs that can sustain continuous domestic silk production rather than representing merely a single, non-renewable shipment of raw material. The technical challenge that Byzantine authorities face in successfully establishing sericulture, once the eggs themselves have survived the journey, should not be understated, since silk production requires far more than simply possessing silkworm eggs. It requires an entire integrated agricultural and manufacturing system that Byzantine territory, prior to this point, has never needed to develop. Mulberry trees, whose leaves constitute the exclusive food source that silkworm larvae require to survive and develop properly, must be identified, planted, and cultivated at sufficient scale to support a growing silkworm population. A horticultural undertaking that itself requires knowledge of appropriate climate conditions, cultivation techniques, and the careful timing required to synchronize mulberry leaf availability with the feeding requirements of developing silkworm larvae across their several molting stages. The silkworms themselves require careful environmental management throughout their life cycle. Appropriate temperature and humidity control, protection from disease and parasites, and the specific handling techniques required to harvest cocoons at the optimal moment before the developing moth inside would otherwise emerge and, in doing so, break the continuous silk filament that constitutes the entire commercial value of the cocoon, since a broken filament dramatically reduces the quality and value of the raw silk thread that can subsequently be reeled from it. Byzantine authorities, working initially with what was almost certainly a very limited founding population of silkworms, derived from whatever quantity of viable eggs the original smuggling operation successfully delivered, must essentially reconstruct through trial, observation, and presumably continued consultation with whatever expertise the original monks or subsequent informants could provide, an entire body of practical agricultural and manufacturing knowledge that Chinese sericulturalists had refined across roughly 4 millennia of continuous development and generational transmission. That Byzantine sericulture succeeds in establishing itself as a viable domestic industry within a relatively compressed time frame following the initial smuggling episode represents, in itself, a remarkable achievement of practical technology transfer and adaptive learning, even setting aside the considerable daring-do of the initial smuggling operation that made the entire subsequent development possible. The economic and geopolitical consequences of successful Byzantine sericulture, once domestic production reaches sufficient scale to meaningfully substitute for imported Chinese silk, unfold across the following decades and centuries in ways that reshape the structure of Eurasian long-distance trade considerably beyond the immediate question of Byzantine silk supply security. Constantinople itself develops, over the following century, into a major silk manufacturing center in its own right, with the imperial government establishing state-controlled or state-supervised silk workshops, organized through Byzantine guild structures that regulate silk production, silk weaving, and silk dyeing, with a level of state oversight and quality control that reflects the continuing strategic and prestige importance the Byzantine state attaches to silk as both an economic commodity and a marker of imperial ceremonial authority. The most prestigious grades of Byzantine silk, particularly silk dyed with the extraordinarily expensive Tyrian purple, derived from the same murex sea snails that had made the ancient Phoenician coast commercially significant a millennium earlier, become restricted by imperial decree to production exclusively for imperial and ecclesiastical use, with the export or private commercial sale of the highest grades of purple-dyed silk explicitly prohibited under Byzantine law, effectively establishing a new state monopoly over the most valuable grades of silk production even as the empire's broader silk industry expands to supply both domestic consumption and, increasingly, export markets across the Mediterranean and European world that had previously depended entirely on the same Chinese supply chains that Byzantium itself had once relied upon. This transformation of Byzantium from silk consumer to silk producer and eventually to silk exporter in its own right does not immediately eliminate the broader Eurasian silk trade or China's continued role as a major silk producer, since Chinese silk production continues throughout this period and beyond, and the overland Silk Road trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean world persist in carrying various goods, including silk, for many centuries after the 6th century smuggling episode. What the establishment of Byzantine domestic silk production does accomplish, however, is the elimination of Byzantine strategic dependence on a single external and politically vulnerable supply chain for a commodity of enormous economic and ceremonial importance to Byzantine state function. No longer must Byzantine access to silk depend on the vagaries of Byzantine-Sassanid relations, on Persian willingness to permit the transit trade to continue during periods of peace, or on the reliability of the various intermediary traders and territories through which silk had previously needed to pass on its long overland or combined overland maritime journey from Chinese production centers to Byzantine markets. Byzantine silk production, once established, functions as a form of strategic resource security precisely analogous to the kind of import substitution and domestic production capacity that modern states confronting comparable vulnerabilities in critical supply chains for strategically important resources continue to pursue as a matter of basic economic and national security policy. The competitive and commercial consequences for the broader Mediterranean and European economy of the emergence of an independent, non-Chinese silk production center within Byzantine territory prove significant across the following centuries, as Byzantine silk manufacturing techniques and, eventually, the underlying sericulture knowledge itself gradually diffuse beyond Byzantine territory into other regions of the Mediterranean world, most significantly into the various Italian city-states, and eventually into southern France and Spain, where domestic European silk industries develop over subsequent centuries that owe their ultimate technical origins to the 6th century Byzantine acquisition of what had once been an exclusively and jealously guarded Chinese manufacturing secret. The medieval and Renaissance silk industries of cities like Lucca, Venice, and eventually Lyon which become major centers of European silk manufacturing and considerable sources of civic wealth and commercial prestige in their own right during the medieval and early modern periods, trace their technical lineage, however indirectly, and through however many intervening centuries of adaptation and further technical development, back to the silkworm eggs that two monks, or possibly a single Persian agent, depending on which contemporary source one credits, successfully smuggled out of Central Asia concealed within hollow bamboo canes in the middle years of the 6th century AD. What the episode of the smuggled silkworms ultimately illustrates, when examined not merely as a colorful anecdote of ancient industrial espionage, but as a case study in the structural dynamics of pre-modern monopoly and technology transfer, is a pattern that recurs with remarkable consistency across the history of manufacturing monopolies protected by trade secrecy rather than by genuinely unrepeatable natural resource endowment. That monopolies of this type, however severely enforced through legal prohibition and however successfully maintained across even quite extended periods of time, remain permanently vulnerable to the singular successful act of technology transfer that, once achieved, cannot subsequently be reversed or contained. China's silk monopoly had survived for roughly 4,000 years of sericulture development and several centuries of intensive Eurasian trade contact, protected by capital punishment for attempted export of the underlying biological and technical knowledge that sericulture depends upon. And yet this multi-millennial monopoly proved unable to survive a single successful smuggling operation conducted by two men carrying hollow walking staves through the gates of a foreign capital. Once silkworm eggs successfully crossed the border in viable condition, and once Byzantine authorities successfully reconstructed the agricultural and manufacturing knowledge required to convert those eggs into a self-sustaining domestic industry, the fundamental economic logic underlying centuries of Chinese silk export revenue and centuries of Persian intermediary customs revenue extracted from controlling Byzantine access to that Chinese silk was permanently altered, in a manner that no subsequent Chinese or Persian policy response could meaningfully reverse. The monopoly that had shaped the economic relationships of the entire Eurasian landmass for the better part of a millennium ended not through military conquest, not through diplomatic negotiation, and not through the gradual erosion of comparative advantage that more typically explains the decline of dominant economic positions across history, but through the successful concealment of a biological cargo small enough to fit inside a monk's walking stick.